Ladies and gentlemen, for our third presentation this morning, I would like to introduce to you Francis Cheneval. Francis is also a member of the NCCR, and he directs a project on the basic principles of the European Constitution. And it is certainly in relation to this project that he will talk today about Demoikratie. Francis has studied philosophy and political science, philosophy at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland and political science at Georgetown University in the United States. He holds a PhD in philosophy, and he has worked, after his PhD, he has worked on the history of philosophy in the Middle Ages and the Age of Enlightenment. And he has also been the National Science Foundation professor at the University of Zurich, studying questions related to the ones he will talk about today. Francis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hans-Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. The focus of my talk is the demos. After all, it's about democracy, and democracy is about the demos, the government of the people. So democracy is a collective coercive action of a demos that needs to be reconciled, as we know, with the freedom of individuals and civil society groups these individuals decide to form. So when I use the term demos this morning, I talk about the political demos, the demos that is acting coercively through institutions and procedures installed on the basis of a constitution or a functional equivalent of a constitution. Now, normative democratic theory, but also empirical democratic theory, usually represents the demos as a self-contained, self-governed singularity. All relations of the demos to the outside world are either eliminated by abstraction or seen as necessarily reducing the quality of self-government of the demos. Let me get familiar with this device. So I think this is not plausible, first of all, from a normative point of view. There is, in political philosophy, the so-called demos problem. That is to say, while we can reasonably think about how the demos comes to democratic decision once it exists, we have no ideal theory about how a demos can be constituted democratically, and that's called the demos problem in normative democratic theory. In other words, strictly spoken, there is no complete, consistent, ideal theory of democracy, because at the beginning of democracy there is the constitution of the demos that cannot be thought as being performed democratically. And this means, of course, that the normative claims and coercive decisions that are made in the name of the demos do not carry the same normative weight as, for example, the universal value of freedom. So you could argue. Secondly, there are negative externalities of self-government for other demoi. In other words, the autonomy of one demos is the heteronomy of another demos and its citizens. Thirdly, we have mobility questions and problems. The mobility of citizens might reduce their rights when they travel or have residence in another demos. So citizens who do not know whether they will be future migrants will have difficulties to reasonably agree with the system of completely self-contained demoi. They would rather agree with the system of reciprocity and mutual recognition of civil and political rights. From a descriptive point of view, I think the theory of a self-contained demos is not plausible as well. First of all, we have the fact of the plurality of demoi. They are not self-contained completely. unless you think of Fichte's work, Der geschlossene Handelsstaat, where a completely closed demos is theoretically constructed, or in some of Rousseau's work. Rousseau was a champion also of the self-contained demos when he talks about, for instance, the Constitution of Corsica. But the fact is that demoi, there's always a plurality of demoi, and they are interdependent. And this interdependence is probably increasing in today's world. Thirdly, I could say that globalization also has an effect of fragmentation. It's interesting that the number of states peoples, if you want to say, is not decreasing with globalization. So we are not going towards the formation of ever greater singularities of a big demos. Rather, we have a fragmentation process of demoi. So even in a theory of globalization, you have to factor in this reality of fragmentation. So there is no intrinsic logic in globalization to an ever greater formation of a big demoi. So on the basis of these normative and descriptive assumptions, my contribution explores the idea of democracy as joint government of peoples, using a term coined by the Oxford colleague Calypso Nicolaides. I call this joint government of peoples demoikracy. To get a grip on the notion of democracy, we could say democracy stands for the common institutional roof of liberal democratic demoi, governing together in areas of their choice. And what is important for a normative point of view, I think the legitimating actors of democracy are not simply citizens, but also communities of citizens that have been constitutionalized and are recognized as demoi. So we have citizens and demoi as the legitimating actors of democracy. Now, according to the basic idea of democracy, you could say liberal democratic states, peoples open their political, economical, and societal systems to each other. They engage in common institution building. They accept common institutional constraints, and they enhance the transnational rights for their citizens. This would be, I think, the normative orientation, the basic idea of what is trying to be achieved when we reasonably think about joint government of peoples. Now, I think there are different types of democracies. There's a multilateral democracy, as I would call it. That is when the participating demoi, they do not forego their sovereignty in the international system. They have a veto power over power conferring rules over basic fundamental constitutional or treaty rules in the system. They also have a right to exit the system at any moment, but they do delegate governmental tasks to majoritarian institutions and supranational agencies. This is, I think, in a nutshell, what a multilateral democracy would do. I think there's also a federal state democracy. Now, conventional wisdom would probably hold that a federal state has a single demos. It might have a single overarching demos, but it might also have composing demoi. Switzerland, for instance, in reality is not a democracy, it's a demoikracy. The Swiss Confederation is composed by the Swiss people and the cantons. And the cantons are constitutionally composed demoi. They have constitutions, they vote, they have competencies, and so forth, and they are even sovereign according to Article 3 of the Swiss Constitution. So Switzerland's sovereignty is not enacted by a singularity of a demos, but by a procedure linking together 26 cantonal demoi and the Swiss national demos. So on constitutional matters, the Swiss vote by double majority of the Swiss people and the cantonal peoples. And this is not direct democracy, it is direct demoikracy. The cantons all have a constitution, and if you read individual cantonal constitutions, you will find that, for instance, in the State and Republic of Geneva, the people are sovereign. So the State and Republic of Geneva itself is a constituted demos, albeit one that is in a certain systemic relation with other demoi. But of course, this cantonal sovereignty is not interpreted in the same way as the sovereignty is interpreted in the multilateral system. But what is important to see, I think, is that in this procedure of direct demoikracy, it is impossible to identify a single sovereign demos within the system, except that the procedure as such constitutes an exercise of sovereignty, but it's a joint exercise of sovereignty. And there is no additional unitary sovereign people mysteriously hidden behind this democratic system, behind this joint exercise of sovereignty. Now, the term sovereignty is, of course, a difficult one. I agree. And we could spend the rest of the morning talking about it. I think, to make it a bit simple, the question of who is sovereign is really the question, who decides who decides? It's the question of the legitimate source of power, the legitimate source of power conferring rules. Now, German constitutional lawyers, they like to call this competence. That is to say, it's about the competence to say which political entities have which competence on several levels of decision making. We can say that sovereignty is the competence to make fundamental power conferring rules as opposed to just making laws. So it's about the law of the second order. It's about power conferring rules. Now, when you think about it, there are two types of making such power conferring rules. First of all, you can simply decide that things should stay the way they are. You could decide on the status quo. Secondly, you want to decide on change. You want to make new rules. Now, in multilateral democracy, as I have described it, the demoi have a veto power. They thus remain fully sovereign regarding the status quo, at least from a formalistic point of view. But regarding the introduction of new power-conferring rules, the consent of all is necessary. So by entering into a multilateral democracy, the member demoi delegate sovereignty over change to the collective body of demoi. And you can immediately see, if you're a political scientist, that it is advantageous to be a founding member of a multilateral democracy, because there you have a veto power over change, and you control change at the beginning. So founding membership has its privileges in democracy. But after that, after the founding moment, a body of demoi can only take decisions over change by unanimity. And this means that the demoi exercise sovereignty over change altogether and altogether only. And if change becomes the overall interest of a demos and the others don't follow, the exit option seems to be the only one open. So since popular sovereignty is not located in a single actor, but in a procedure interlinking actors, it is not correct to say that popular sovereignty vanishes whenever several demoi exercise sovereignty together. The only difference to more unitary systems of demoi is that the participating demoi take part in the exercise of procedural sovereignty. as opposed to other instances of the same government. So you could say that the procedural rules determine to what extent their sovereignty is checked. You could say democracy is checks and balances among demoi. And to the extent that checks and balances do not negate the notion of sovereignty, I don't think sovereignty vanishes. It's just procedurally organized in a different way. So for all practical purposes, I can say that no member demos will just be interested in status quo, and no member demos will just be interested in change. So from a political science point of view, I think they will be played off against each other in democratic decision-making. But I think I'll leave this calculus of what it means to the political scientists. I'm not going to go into that. Now, if we take the distinction between status quo sovereignty and change sovereignty to the federal state democracy, we see, for instance, in Switzerland, which has a federal constitution that can only be changed by a majority of cantonal peoples and a majority of Swiss citizens linked together. So the Swiss cantonal demoi have no sovereignty over the status quo. But a majority of them has sovereignty over the status quo. So sovereignty over status quo has not been delegated to a federal state, single unitary demos, but to a procedure in which a majority of cantonal demoi have status quo sovereignty. That is why it makes sense to answer the question, who decides, the question of popular sovereignty, in favor of this procedure and not in favor of a singular Swiss people. There's an institutional procedure connecting the Swiss people and the cantonal people. You could call this the procedural exercise of popular sovereignty. Now, it has been obvious that when I talk about presence of democracy, the title of my talk, I mean the Swiss reality. And it would be very interesting to go into an analysis which other federal states would fall into the category rather of democracy than democracy. We could go on in this analysis. I'm not going to do that this morning for reasons of time. The EU, I think, on the other hand, is a multilateral democracy. And to most lawyers, this distinction between federal democracy and multilateral democracy is clear-cut because there is a treaty-based, the power-conferring rules in the EU are determined by a treaty in which the members have a veto power, whereas the Swiss power-conferring rules are determined by constitutional procedures where the cantons have a majoritarian weight. So we could go on in talking about the concrete distinction between the two systems, and I think in political science we could also point to many gray areas where actually Swiss democracy, federal state democracy, and European democracy are quite similar, and we could go into that. You could, for instance, show that in Switzerland, since the cantons have competencies that sometimes are bigger than their capacities, there's a lot of intercantonal conventions. Switzerland is also a very complex system of intercantonal cooperation. I usually call it a post-cantonal constellation. So we could also point to these sorts of similarities. But I think overall, it still makes sense to point to the different interpretation of sovereignty that is at stake in multilateral democracy and in federal state democracy. Now you could ask which form of democracy is more democratic. And I can't answer the question since we have seen this morning we have a democracy barometer, but we don't have a democracy barometer. And maybe Switzerland should be in the democracy barometer and not in the democracy barometer. Maybe it shouldn't be compared to Denmark, because Denmark has a single demos. Switzerland is a multiple demoi system, and as I said, the multiple demoi system in itself carries a normative advantage that has to be factored in when it's compared to single demos system. So Switzerland's comparative democratic advantage to single demos states is difficult to evaluate. It is also difficult to evaluate versus the European Union because we have a different interpretation of sovereignty. So the question, which system is more democratic is not so easy to answer. The Swiss would, of course, immediately say, yes, in any kind of democracy, you have long chains of legitimation, and what you have to do when this is the case is a direct democratic check on the decisions made by, faraway representatives. So we could debate the question to what extent this is should be the case in the European Union. Actually, the European Union does not forbid direct democratic vote on treaties. Every nation, every member state is free to hold a popular vote on the treaties, and that in itself actually poses a problem, and I've worked on this. We can maybe talk about this in the Q&A, because this kind of chaotic way of dealing with direct democracy on the level of treaty ratification, I think, poses a problem. So on the level of power conferring rules, it's not so clear that direct democracy in the European Union does not exist and should not exist. Now, many people would also say that the EU does not have a single demos, not have an overarching demos, as Switzerland has an overarching demos. It's clear, the EU is first of all a community of member states, of member demoi, but as I have tried to show, if you talk about the political demos, that is to say, the demos that is constituted by institutions and procedures, it's not so clear to me whether the EU doesn't have a demos, because its citizens elect a parliament. They are under the jurisdiction of a highest court. They are regulated by common regulatory agencies, and they are governed also by close intergovernmental cooperation. So you could say they form an overarching demos. And the question, how democratic is the European Union, should be changed into the question, how demoicratic is the European Union? And what does that question imply? That question implies, what competencies does the demos, the overarching demos, have that haven't been delegated to it by the member demoi? And so you can make an argument when the argument of democratic deficit of the European Union has first been raised by, I think, a British scholar who missed in the European system his own British sovereignty of parliament. Now, if the European Parliament had sovereignty of parliament without that sovereignty had been delegated to it by the decision of the demoi, I would say the EU would have a democratic deficit. And so when we talk about the democratic deficit of the EU, I think we should change perspective and think, what are the principles of democracy, and into what respect does the EU correspond or not correspond to principles of democracy? And then you might reach the conclusion, yes, there are many deficiencies, of course, but the fact that the European Parliament does not have the same competencies as a national parliament is not in itself a symptom of democratic deficit. Okay, so I think I should also talk a little bit about the future. This was about the present, an analysis about the present. Now let's change focus to the future. I'm always very embarrassed when I have to talk about the future, because I think concerning human affairs, there is no science and there are no experts on the future. So I don't think we can claim to really have the same scientific evidence when we talk about the future than when we talk about the past. So scientists make informed synthetic judgments about the future. They're usually very intelligent, extremely appealing, and totally wrong. So that's because history often progresses by surprising events nobody foresees. So what can I say about the future of democracy in Europe or of democracy in Switzerland? Of course, to be on the safe side, we make conditional statements and ceteris paribus assumptions. If X continues to be the case, then Y will be the case, all other things being equal, and so forth. So we're on the safe side, but we don't necessarily make statements that hold a lot of scientific evidence. But I think some things can be outlined for for multilateral democracy. And I think we have heard this morning from Wolfgang Merkel that democracy is actually in pretty good shape in democratic states. So we have the continuous existence of liberal democratic states. I think we can expect that, at least that's a trend that we can see. There is no absolute crisis and decline. And since the single democratic states are the units that compose democracy, this condition is actually in pretty good shape in many parts of the world, and it might even be getting better because democracies get also not only more democratic or less democratic, but also more liberal. I think many examples that were raised this morning have not so much to do with collective decision-making as such, but with individual rights, inclusion of residents, long-term residents, better respect and better rights for homosexuals and other social minorities. So we're democratically progressing on the liberal side, on the side of granting basic rights. So as long as, and since these liberal individual rights are important for democracy, because democracy is about freedom of movement and reciprocity of rights, I think there's a good perspective here that democracy can exist. And we also think that economic integration, interdependence will go on, and states look for larger market opportunities, and so increased cooperation on the economic level will continue, and the same could be said, I think, for ecological problems and security policy. So the pressure to govern together is more likely to increase than decrease. Which means that, governmental functions will have to be delegated to higher levels. And then I could make an argument that is presented by a scholar I particularly like. It's Christian Roy-Smith. He uses a terrible jargon of holistic constructivism. Basically means something very simple. The international system is always determined or influenced by the moral purpose of the states that compose the system. So if you have an international system of absolute sovereign princes, you will have a certain international system. If you have an international system of liberal democracies, Smith argues, you have a different international system, because there's going to be pressure that the system reflects some domestic aspects of society, that is to say, transnational rights. So the rule of law in the international system has precisely come into it because it was started to be composed by democracies under the leadership, I think, of the United States, it's fair to say. And if you continue that argument, you could also say, okay, if the international system is, or if democracies create an international system among themselves, the civil societies, the citizens will want to see in the common institutions some principles of democracy reflected. So there's going to be a pressure that these common institutions should be governed along the same lines, or according to certain principles of democracy, and not just an authoritarian type rule of law. So I think from this point of view, you can make a good argument that there is, as long as liberal democracies interact with each other in a very intensive way, they will also try to create common institutions that reflect these values. And if these demoi do not want to form a federal state, and that's the third point that it's important, I think there's evidence that demoi do not want to just merge into a bigger demos and lose their political identity. So they want to retain a considerable amount of status of sovereignty and of decision-making power. So the answer is, okay, an intermediate multilateral democratic system that is stabilized. Then it's a whole set of arguments from new regionalism. Actually, we talk about the European Union, and people say, okay, it's a completely historically unique event, has nothing to do with the rest of the world. There's no multilateral integration of this type in any part of the world. I think the literature on new regionalism has a different focus. It points to tendencies in Latin America, to tendencies in Central America, to tendencies in Asia. Again, here I leave this discussion open to the specialists of international relations, but I think from what I've read, there's some convincing arguments to be presented. And maybe to finish, what can I say about the stability of the EU? There's a lot of talk about the instability of the euro. What can we say about the stability of the EU? Recently, the Swiss writer Thomas Hürlimann, whom some of you might know, has said on television that he expects the European Union to disappear, just like the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire have disappeared. All transnational political bodies are doomed to failure. I don't know if the EU will disappear or not, but I think it's a completely false analogy, because the essence of the European Union is, first of all, that you have components that are free, liberal demoi, that have freely decided to join the Union, many of them in direct democratic decisions. There are common democratic institutions like the Parliament, which is freely elected by the citizens. There is the rule of law. There is a solid guarantee of individual rights. All of this is far less from perfect, but we know that these kinds of institutions, once they are in place in societies that have a per capita income above $6,000 a year, are incredibly stable. So I would say that there's a big difference between Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the essential difference is free democracy. I was going to thank you for your attention, but I learned yesterday in an excellent talk that you are biologically incapable of paying attention, so I thank you very much for trying. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Barden.
Maybe in an attempt to get the picture more clear, I mean, I found this very inspiring and useful, also in thinking further about democracy and demoikracy. When we look at the current Swiss situation, to start from an empirical example, where the integration into the European Union hasn't taken place through, I mean, the basic common market, nor like the political union, but through an equivalent, functionally equivalent way, one might say, the bilateral treaties. So how would you describe in terms of demoikracy the current state of these bilateral dealings and taking part and being submitted and influencing in one way or another, at least in certain, I mean, domains, or full membership in the union? In terms of what difference does it make, and how would you, I mean, what concepts would you apply? Is the current state more like a implicit democracy, like a latent, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, you know, of course, it depends how you evaluate the fact that Switzerland actually takes in many of these EU laws and directives and just puts them into its legal system without having a say in Brussels. So the standard argument is, you know, this is a deficiency actually of sovereignty, because we would have actually more sovereignty if we were also present in the Brussels institutions mechanism. And other people say, no, it's essential to have these areas where Switzerland wants to retain, let's say, change sovereignty, that it stays out of it. And I think it's a difficult trade-off maybe between state sovereignty and popular sovereignty for the Swiss, because they think that the fact to have the possibility of referendum is very important. I see it as difficult because what you give to the European Union when you join is apples, and what you get back is like bananas. And some people like apples better, and others like bananas better, and they can't agree in Switzerland. You know, some people say what we give away is too precious, and what we get back is not as precious to us. So that's where the argument is. I think if you all things considered, the exercise of sovereignty maybe also of popular sovereignty would actually be quite advantageous within the Union, because even on the lawmaking level, where supposedly there could be no referendum, that's not entirely true, because only these EU laws that have direct effect on Swiss laws would not be under referendum. For the others, there's a certain margin, and there the people could do referenda, and Switzerland could test the limits. I think we should be in the EU and never ask for permission, but always ask for forgiveness when we adapt the EU legal system. So, and on the treaty-making level, of the level of power-conferring rules, there's a veto power. If you factor that into the Swiss system, this means that the 14 smallest Swiss cantons have a veto power on European treaties. And if you count that together, a population of 1.8 million would actually get a veto power on European treaties, which is quite a leverage. Now, of course, politically, it will not be possible to enact it that way, but it's still an incredible weight that popular sovereignty would gain on this treaty-making level. So I think the argument that direct democracy is completely incompatible with EU membership is flawed. I see it as a very flawed argument, although I'm not saying it doesn't have disadvantages, and maybe if these disadvantages are very precious to people, then so be it. But from a political philosophical point of view, there is no complete dichotomy or exclusion between EU membership and direct democracy. On the contrary, I think you also gain popular leverage through the treaty-making process, where the future architecture of Europe is determined. So I think it's an important weight that a small minority of Swiss cantons could actually gain. Now, if you turn the argument around, you would ask, does the EU want something like that? I mean, would it be good for the other 500 million to be blocked by 1.8 million central Swiss small cantons on treaty matters? That's the other question.
I hope the Swiss cantons will never join the European Union. I have a question about the concept of demos. You gave it a kind of political definition or legal definition. Yeah. And the question is, of course, how much does this feed back into the social dimension? As a sociologist would say, well, you need a kind of Gemeinschaft. In the old sense, demos must be a Gemeinschaft in order to convey not only liberal rights but also social rights to the people. So all the redistribution of the national income or the taxation issues will probably be confined to demos in the sociological sense. And the question is whether this is not growing also on the European level, and in a way it's also growing on a global level. There are elements of a world society or of European society, for instance, when you consider the redistribution in the structural funds, the people in Europe are willing to redistribute quite a lot of resources. And on the global level, they are also willing to accept that for single issues, for crisis issues, food crisis, educational crisis, climate crisis, many funds are channeled to the global level. So there is some kind of feeling in the background that we belong to more than the nation state. We belong to a European society and to a global society. That is very limited, of course, but it's growing, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. I haven't talked at all about the genealogy of the demos, of course. And I think you're perfectly right. There are cultural, social conditions to be reckoned with when you explain how does a political demos, how is a political demos possible. But I still think that these social conditions can also be formed by the institutions. I think we overestimate solidarity of a Gemeinschaft. When you look at history, I mean, how did social systems come into our society? I think it was quite a struggle, I don't think it just grew out of because we are an organic society, Gemeinschaft, that has as its highest ideal solidarity. No, workers had to go into the streets, they had to strike, there were clashes of different social movements, and this has then led to certain social institutions which the demos has coercively enacted. So I think it's hard to say, I wouldn't say there's a pre-political Gemeinschaft. I think there are non-political conditions, but it's always very, very hard to determine what is really pre-political. And I think especially this issue of solidarity is sometimes, we overestimate the term Gemeinschaft in it, and we underestimate societal struggles in which certain socially disadvantaged groups have fought for their rights and have gained their rights at the basis of struggle, not at the basis of solidarity. That was pre-politically there already. And of course, the second point of your question, I think I agree with you. I think there are probably signs that the overarching demos of the European Union might be getting stronger, and there might be signs that we go towards very weak but overarching demoi regionally or maybe even globally. That is an empirical question that I didn't address so far. I just would say what I disagree with philosophically is the idea of cosmopolitanism as being a world state under a single global demos. I think that is philosophically wrong. Now what is going to happen empirically in the integration among the really existing demoi is an interesting question, and I tend to agree with you. There might be signs for hopeful building up of demoi on higher levels, yes.
Welcome.
Yes, I'd like to ask two questions. One is a follow-up to the previous question, really. I think, in a sense, all the demois you presented in your talk, I would describe them as national demoi. They are described in terms of a geographic location and the population within that. I don't know if this is a required definition of a demoi, but one could, in principle, imagine demois that are based on social or cultural definitions. For example, one could imagine, as a very concrete and maybe slightly provocative example, to have Romas be represented as a demos in Europe with amongst the various other national demois. So my first question is, does this can your definition of demos extend to such groups? And if so, does it make sense to have them be part of a democracy, or would a democracy not function if special cultural or social interest groups would come together in such a system? That's the first question. The second question is, well, you criticized the democracy at the beginning of your talk, and I have to say I agree with many of the critiques you say about democracy, but there is one I would see as the key value of democracy is that because it only represents the demos, when the demos changes, its opinion, its views change, the democracy naturally evolves with the demos. But with a democracy, it seems to me that there is at the founding stage of the democracy a point where the demoi that will make up the democracy are chosen, and therefore, in a sense, freezing the power structure of the democracy. Do you see possibilities, or do you agree with that as being an issue with democracy? And do you see ways of reducing this risk? Or, yes, that's what I'd like you to comment if you have any ideas on that subject. Thank you.
Yes, I think it's important. My presupposition is I talk about the demos as a unity of coercive collective action that therefore also has institutional capacities to do so, and tied to this institutional capacity usually is also the control of a territory. So it's territorialized political demoi that are the most eligible and probably the most conducive to a stable and functional demoikracy. I wouldn't say national demoi, it's state demos. You know, I think the Belgian demos is not a national demos, so to speak, from a cultural point of view, but it's a nation-state demos if you take the French notion of nation, which is a political notion, which is the same we have in Switzerland, by the way. For us also, nation means the political unit and not the ethnological or cultural parts of it. So I would say that for the functionality of the system, the representation has to be of territorialized demo and other demo. I think I would agree with you. There can be other forms. I more thought about constitutional systems like Colombia, where the indigenous peoples have large autonomy, and so I think this is also a type of democracy we should look at and we should reflect. And I think I see no reason why a large non-territorialized nation such as the Roma should not get some sort of representation. I think there's a normative argument against it, except that the majority of participating demo will probably have to be territorialized demo, because in order to guarantee certain functions of political coercion, I think this element has to be in it. I can't imagine a democracy of non-territorialized demo and just functional demo or whatever. I think that would be an anti-political conception, and I think it would be doomed to fail. The second question is about, I think it's like every demos has the problem of the conditions of accession, of taking in new members, and I think every democracy has the same problem, and then we have to reflect on what will be an acceptable normative theory for accession. I don't think you can just have it grow infinitely. A democracy will probably have to be limited at one point. But that's, again, that's a complicated question, because it's not like taking in new members. It's like adding up new territories with a constitutional vote. And so the rules will be very different. But I think as a general rule, a democracy will probably have a certain system of inclusion and exclusion of new members, and the question then will be, what would be the adequate criteria for that? And I think over that there is great debate. Should Turkey join the EU? That's a question like that. Will it push the whole system out of balance? Should the European citizens and demo vote on this, or should it be a decision of the Commission? It is, of course, a decision of the member demo. So, as I said, membership has its privilege. If you're already in, then you vote on the accession of new members. That's the way it is. Now, maybe this should be done with more constitutional checks and balances, but I think basically a democracy will not be stable if it takes in new members nobody else wants.
Final question, Wolfgang Merkel.
Francis, you argued one should not compare Denmark as a democracy with Switzerland as a democracy, and probably not France with Canada or the United States as well. But nevertheless, allow me a question on the comparison. I'm a hopeless comparativist, and I think it is a question of having the right indicators, and then you can ask question, which of these two types of democracy and democracy have advantages if it comes to stability and quality. Is it right, or how would you answer the question that the costs for democracy in terms of transparency, accountability, and efficiency in decision-making and decision implementations are higher than in democracies, and this at the end leads maybe to a lower quality of democracy or a higher instability of democracy?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. Just one point I would add, when you say quality of democracy and you have your indicators, when in the category of democracy, I would add another very important indicator, and that's non-domination of smaller collectivities. And if you add that indicator, yes, but non-domination of smaller collectivities granted by certain veto rights. So I think a demos that is single simply has maybe the problem of not discriminating against social minorities. But I'm not talking about social minorities. I'm talking about republics who stand as demoi, who have the status of being an independent demos. And so the Swiss system has actually, it's a system where such republics govern together. And there's only so much, there's a certain quality of such a system that I think is intrinsically quite different from the quality you can expect from a single demos entity. Now, many factors or indicators that you have, I think would be the same, the inclusion of long-term residents and so forth. So I'm not saying Switzerland would score necessarily much higher. I'm just saying let's beware of errors of category.
And about the efficiency and stability?
Well, I think the efficiency criteria would also be different. I mean, the stability is not something that Swiss democracy is lacking. And efficiency of what? Efficiency of what is the question. Because when you have a multiple demoi system, you have a greater difference in the value of that should be attributed to the criteria of efficiency. You probably have a greater diversity of value system. So already to have a utilitarian criteria of efficiency is probably is just more questionable in a system where you have multiple demoi.
But you have a multi-level system of governance. And this creates, as we know, for example, from the European Union, inefficiency in decision-making, very often on the lowest common denominator, and then low compliance to the decision taken by the European Union.
Yes, but no, again, what's the point of comparison? You can't compare this kind of efficiency with an efficiency you would get in a single demos system. You would have to compare the European Union's efficiency with the efficiency of a similar, of a system that is complex in a similar way. And then you know whether this European Union efficiency is really so much worse than what you would get in another demoikratic system. It's easy to show that it would be more efficient if you have a small group of people who agree, who share common values and so forth. So the point of comparison is important, no? I have that problem when you criticize consociationalism, etc. It's a long discussion too, but the point of comparison has to be what better arrangement could you get in a society that is so profoundly fragmented or segmented as that society is. You can always imagine a more unified society that then is also more efficient, but the point of comparison has to be, would there be a better system given the conditions of fragmentation? Would there be a more efficient system given the conditions of fragmentation?
Okay, thank you very much.